This is U.S. History 1, PowerPoint Lecture 1.1, Part B. This is a continuation of the preceding PowerPoint on the foundings of the colonies, and as we would in an on-ground class where you just pick up where we left off, we were discussing the different economic administrations of the various colonies, and where we had left off was in the Chesapeake colonies of the English settlements, most notably Maryland and Jamestown, later Virginia. And I wanted to include this slide because it's significant. It's going to create, it doesn't look like much, but it's going to create a significant difficulty. Okay, as I mentioned, in the Chesapeake colonies, tobacco will serve as the backbone of the economy. It will, among other things, be the basis of credit. Okay, and you see what happens here. Not surprisingly, we discussed the headright system and things like that. As land expansion continued, and as the planting of tobacco increased, the exports of tobacco to Great Britain increased. And one of those basic economic principles that we want you to walk away from Robert Morris with is the more you have of something, whatever that thing may be, the less valuable each of them is. This is the case with tobacco. And so you see, there's no data available from 1640 to 1680 on the tobacco trade, but you see how it shoots up by the end of the 17th century. It'll be over 37 million pounds a year that's imported by Great Britain from the Chesapeake colonies. Now, commensurately with that, of course, as the supply of tobacco goes up, the price of tobacco plummets. And this is going to create a problem. Now, where the problem lies, just to kind of get at it quickly, we're going to discuss it again later on in this PowerPoint a little bit, is the tobacco farmers would use as collateral the following year's crop of tobacco. In other words, they would borrow money to meet their necessities. Okay, whatever those necessities might be, they would borrow money. They would borrow it against the next year's crop. And that's perfectly well as long as there's a stable amount of tobacco being produced and therefore a stable price. But as tobacco increases in production and the price plummets, the value of that tobacco is going to go down, and so the actual value of the next year's crop won't be stable. Okay, and so creditors will begin to lose out because they're actually lending money and then getting less back because the tobacco drops in price. That's one of the problems. The other problem is that what you don't see in this slide is tobacco was not of uniform quality. Okay, what you're looking at here is an average. Higher quality tobacco would get more money. Lower quality tobacco would get less money. And when we get to the Maryland Tobacco Inspection Act, the problem is that they'll hold us, the tobacco farmers will use as collateral the next year's tobacco crop. But then when it comes time to trade it to the creditor, they'll give them the poor quality tobacco. And so that's going to lead to really what is the first regulation in U.S. history, even though it predates the United States by a little better than a century. In the middle colonies, the economic administration was based on the fur trade, and this would become competition with both the French and the Dutch in the middle colonies. The French in Canada, above the St. Lawrence, and the Dutch in New Amsterdam, and which includes New York and New Jersey. And it will be one of the precipitory causes. It won't be the main precipitory cause, but it will be one of the precipitory causes of the Anglo-Dutch Wars of the mid-17th century, which will finalize with the Second Anglo-Dutch War in 1664, leading to the forfeiture of mainland colonies by the Dutch. The Dutch will remain in the West Indies, but they'll lose New York and New Jersey, which will become Royal Crown colonies under James II. The competition with the Dutch. The mainstay, however, of the middle colonies is not the fur trade. The mainstay is a shipbuilding industry. By the time of the American Revolution, nearly 90% of all ship production for the British Empire is done in the middle colonies, most notably in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. And they will become not only a shipbuilding industry, but also a shipping industry. in terms of farming, they won't really have a commercial cash crop as you see in the lower South and in the Chesapeake. They don't have the equivalent of tobacco. What they have is subsistence farming. And again, what we had in Maryland of the Chesapeake colonies, we'll have also in Pennsylvania. It will be a proprietary administration. In the Carolinas, you will have a proprietary administration, and what the Carolinas will resemble more so than Pennsylvania is they will create an aristocracy. It's given as a proprietorship to a small collective of people who will become the aristocracy. And this actually will become the forerunner of the plantation society. That's why the closest thing that America ever develops for an aristocracy is the plantation society of the Deep South, which we'll talk about at a little bit greater length later on. But you'll create an aristocracy, and it will be in the Carolinas that you first do this. And this is before North and South Carolina are divided into two colonies. Their cash crop is not going to be tobacco. Their cash crop will be rice and indigo, which is used in the dyeing of clothes. North Carolina, the northern part, will grow tobacco. The reason for this is that the Deep South is too hot to grow tobacco. It'll burn up the crop. North Carolina is about the only place. That's why Virginia and Chesapeake tobacco works better. Interestingly enough, when the transition in the late 18th century is from tobacco to cotton, Virginia and Maryland will not be able to make that transition because cotton requires a lot of moisture and a lot of heat, which the lower South is tailor-made for. Tobacco doesn't like that much moisture and doesn't like that much heat, so it's not a viable cash crop in most of the Deep South. This will be from really Texas to Georgia once the western parts come online. What they will instead have rice and indigo. Rice requires a lot of heat and a lot of water. That's why Southeast Asia is the main rice producer of the world nowadays. Now, in New England, this is where we start to get into problems, and as we trace out over the next number of slides, as we trace this out, we'll see that one of the main precipitory causes of the revolution is that under the trading system of England, New England really has no way of making any money. Okay, where actually New England's going to make the vast majority of its money is after the Navigation Acts come in 1651, which we'll talk about in just a minute here. Smuggling. John Hancock is probably the most famous of the smugglers from the New England states. So they have no cash crop. It's subsistence farming, and they have no commercial industry. Okay, they have cottage industries that produce only their basic needs, and the reason for this is because, again, we'll discuss in just a second the Navigation Acts. When they come in online and under the mercantile trading system, which again we'll explain in just a minute here, the North American colonies are prohibited from creating a manufacturing sector because such a manufacturing sector would compete with the manufacturing sector of Great Britain. Okay, so they're prohibited from developing it, and so New England really has nothing. We'll discuss this at greater length when we talk about the trade relationships inherent between the colonies and Great Britain. In terms of political administration, in order for us to understand how the political administration, how political development takes place in the colonies, it's essential that we first lay the basis of the contract theory of government. And I know probably most of you are unfamiliar with the contract theory of government. Let me familiarize you with it. It is, in large part, exactly what it sounds like. Okay? The basic idea behind it is that there exists within any society, within a community, two basic contracts. One is between the members of that society. Okay? The other is between the members of the society and whatever governing agency they put in place to govern them. And so what you have is a contract between the people and the government of those people. Okay? And as is true with any contract, a contract involves the exchange of goods and or services. That's the basis of contract theory. It's going to be nursed out through really the middle 16th century until the middle of the 18th century. And you see the main contributors to it. It's not an exhaustive list. You have Francis Bacon as well, but you have Thomas Hobbes, who's the first to write on it. Then you have John Locke. John Locke's going to become extraordinarily important to us. Then you have Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Okay? And based on what I've just developed for you is the basic idea of contract theory. What that contract is varies greatly. In other words, what the government owes to its population and what the population owes to its government varies greatly depending on what kind of contract you create, what kind of system you create. And so, for example, if we look at Hobbes, and this is nursed out in his book, The Leviathan, okay, the sovereign, which is the embodiment of the body politic, okay, it's the embodiment of society itself, has absolute power for the protection of life and possession. For Hobbes, the reason for the establishment of the government, okay, is to protect me on some fine, warm summer's day as I'm sitting there under an oak tree by a riverside, enjoying my jujubes and cheesy poofs and just kind of enjoying myself. There is nothing in the state of nature to prevent someone who is bigger and stronger than me from coming along, thunking me on the head with a pipe, and then taking all my stuff. Okay? That's what government's for. Government is there to prevent that from happening. Beyond that, there's not an awful lot of purpose for government. Okay? However, government is given the authority to within that parameter, do anything and everything necessary to protect life and possession. Okay? And so you have a very loose establishment of this contract. And in fact, way back when, back in 1990 mumbly something or other, the early 90s, when I was teaching at Miami University, I was teaching political philosophy as a graduate student. In one of the classes, one of the classes that I had, I asked them the question, what would Hobbes think of taxation? Would Hobbes be in favor of or opposed to things like the income tax, property tax? And there were a variety of answers, none of which were particularly correct, except for one girl. I remember her really well. She transferred out of Miami and went to Vanderbilt. And her answer was spot on. She found in Hobbes a direct quote from Hobbes that taxation is completely unnecessary. It's unnecessary because the government has the authority to do whatever is necessary to protect life and possession. Meaning, they don't need to tax the people to pay for services. They simply commandeer them. Okay? Whatever's necessary. Now, when it comes to Locke, we have a much more limited understanding of government. This is exposed, nursed out in the Second Treatise on Civil Government, published in 1688, in the wake of, actually published in 1689, in the wake of the Glorious Revolution in England. Now, we'll discuss this at greater length again when we get to the U.S. Constitution and the Articles of Confederation, and the philosophical premise behind the United States. The United States Constitution, and the United States itself, is based on a number of different sources. Three primary sources. John Locke's Second Treatise on Civil Government, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract, which I'll discuss in just a second, and then the Constitution, essentially, of the Iroquois Confederacy. That, in fact, is where they'll create the federal system, which we'll get to by and large a little bit later from now. But among other things, in the Second Treatise on Civil Government, Locke will be the first to express and develop two things. First, the idea of majority rule, and second, the development of three distinct branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. And in my comparative political systems class, one of the things we look at is that regardless of the political system, every political system currently in existence on the planet has these three branches of government. Even the more closed political systems, such as the People's Republic of China or Iran or Zimbabwe, they still have these three. Now, the balance of power between them varies greatly based on the political system. Okay, and for Locke, and this really gets kind of interesting. This is political philosophy is ultimately, I suppose, my favorite thing of all to teach. Locke creates the idea of natural right. And he creates it not really in the second treatise on civil government. He uses it there. He creates it in a piece that he talks about in the essay called the Essay on Human Understanding. Most significantly, Locke will establish property right, and it's something that we all kind of know. We know the corrupted form of Locke's statement on property. You've all heard, I'm sure, that what do they say? They say possession is 9/10 of the law. That's a corruption of John Locke. John Locke's actual statement is that labor is 99/100ths of possession. In other words, what makes something mine is that I've labored for it. And then what government's constituted for is to protect natural right, because individuals cannot be trusted to adjudicate fairly in questions of natural rights when they're involved, specifically when their interests are involved. They have to recuse themselves and allow a neutral third party to decide, to arbitrate the matter. That's what government's for. Okay? And for Locke, you have a natural right to life, liberty, and possession. Possession I've already discussed about. 99/100ths of possession is your labor. Okay? He then discusses in Essay on Human Understanding at great length the idea of life and liberty. This, of course, will become, in a corrupted form, the basis of Thomas Jefferson when he writes the Declaration of Independence, that we hold certain rights to be inalienable. Well, these rights are natural rights. Natural rights, Locke brings up, are inalienable rights. So this will be the creation of the idea of inalienable rights, rights that can't be taken away. They can't be taken away because these rights are given to us by God, by a supreme being. Okay? Jefferson will, of course, corrupt this and change it a little bit, take a little poetic license, and call it life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And really, when you think about it, it's the same thing, because when you think about it, let's think about this now. A lot of happiness has to do with possession, right? The more you have, the happier you are. Maybe not. Maybe, I digress. Maybe not. Okay. Now, for Rousseau, he writes The Social Contract. This will be in the early 18th century, and he'll clarify some of these points. For Rousseau, everything is the general will. Okay? What Jefferson will refer to when he writes the Declaration of Independence, and what Madison will get at in the Constitution, is the common welfare. Okay? Now, it's important to remember this when we deal with contract theory, that the general will is not the sum total of all the individual wills. The general will for Rousseau, as he discusses it in the Social Contract, is essentially the common denominator that binds a community together. In other words, for a community to be a community, it presupposes that they have some communal interest, some mutual interest in getting together. Otherwise, they wouldn't be a community. Okay? The question, of course, is what is that common interest? What is that general will? Government is then instituted to advance and support the general will. Well, what Rousseau nurses out is that the general will, okay, in rough and ready terms, is to be able to pursue my possession and use my possession without the interference of outside agencies, okay, or persons. In other words, I should be left alone with my stuff to do as I see fit with my stuff. That's the basic general will. Now, it should be perhaps parenthetically added that Rousseau writes another piece called The Confessions, and as it works out, Rousseau was a horrible human being. He was a child molester. He was a womanizer. He was a wife abuser. Okay? And so for Rousseau, basically, what he envisioned was a society where your possession is yours. Okay? And your family is an extension of your possessions. So you have your white picket fence, which essentially is your castle. And within your castle walls, you can do whatever you want. Okay, so let's not go thinking that Rousseau is all that liberal-minded. Uh, he was quite the ne'er-do-well, actually. Okay, that's the basis of contract theory, and I'll touch on this again as we go into the philosophical foundations of the United States and how we get into the revolution and things like that. From this, we derive the basic early contracts of the colonies. The oldest representative body in the United States is the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses is created after the Virginia colony becomes Virginia. In other words, after the Jamestown colony goes bankrupt in the wake of the Second Powhatan War, and the Royal Crown takes it over, they will establish the House of Burgesses. And so one of the things that's kind of true and not true, we'll deal with this at great length when we get to the revolution itself, and the prelude to the revolution is this idea of taxation without representation. That's true and that's not true. The colonists did have some representation within the colonies, okay? All of the colonies will have legislative bodies of various and sundry sources. The proprietary colonies tend to have a less effective legislative body than do the joint stock companies, but they'll still have some. Like even William Penn will have a legislature, although he has veto power over it, etc., etc., etc. Now, in the House of Burgesses, and this is one of the things that will become a recurring theme all the way up to modern times, people will think this. Voting in the House of Burgesses and voting in the community is based on land ownership. The basic thinking behind this, okay, is that land ownership gives you a vested interest in the community. The only people that should be able to make authoritative decisions binding to the community are the people who have skin in the game. Okay, are the people who contribute financially to the community. This is a recurring theme. There are people to this day that think that. That think that the only people really in the United States that should vote are the people that pay taxes. Okay, because they're the only ones who it matters to. Right? They're the ones who are contributing to the society. Therefore, they should be the only ones that vote. This will become a very furious debate between Madison and Jefferson and Adams, principally, and Hamilton as well will throw his 2 cents in here. Actually, he'll be one of the primary interlocutors now that I think about it. When it comes time to writing the U.S. Constitution. Because, for example, for Alexander Hamilton, he agrees with this. The only people that should be voting, the only people that have a vested interest in the community are the landowners, the people that are contributing to the society. Jefferson will contradict this and be supported by Madison and say, no. They'll borrow their argument from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Regardless of whether or not they contribute to the society financially, regardless of whether or not they own land, they have to be allowed to vote. Not because they're contributing to the society, but because the laws that are binding to the community will be binding to them as well. Because the laws will be binding to them, they have to have a voice in what those laws are going to be. Clear enough? That's ultimately how that argument's gonna end up come the end of the 18th century. In New England, you have an assembly of political rights, and I've mentioned this before, that unlike is commonly parlayed in U.S. history, these were not communities of religious freedom. Okay, to be able to have a stake in the community, to be able to own property, to be able to vote, okay, to have any representation whatsoever, you had to be a member of their church. Okay, and so voting is based on church membership. Maryland establishes a Catholic assembly. As I mentioned before, Maryland was founded as a safe haven for Catholics. The Protestants, for the most part, will be the indentured servants. And we want to go over this again. We'll go over this at the end of this PowerPoint a little bit, that an indentured servant is not a slave. An indentured servant willingly exchanges their labor for a specified period of time in exchange for passage to the New World. And after the headright system comes in, which we talked about previously in, I think, 1.1a, The headright system gives 50 acres of free land to all 50 acres of land to all free white settlers. Okay, well, after your period of indentured servitude, usually 7 years, is over, you are then a free white settler and you get 50 acres of land. This acts, the reason that they adopt this is it acts as an extra inducement for people to sign on as indentured servants. Because by this time, this is now middle of the 17th century that this is starting to all come online, the production of tobacco is going up and it's exceeding the increase in production and the increase in demand is exceeding the supply of labor. There just aren't enough indentured servants to produce the tobacco necessary that England's demanding. This ultimately will be why the indentured servitude system will kind of give way to slavery, because there just simply aren't enough indentured servants signing on. And so they'll start the plantation system and slavery. Maryland will pass the Act of Religious Toleration in 1649 because, as it is a safe haven for Catholics, you have all these Protestant indentured servants. Well, the Protestant indentured servants will serve as indentured servants for about 7 years, after which they become free. Okay? And they have to be, at that point, the question is, do they have a voting stake in the community, or do we try to preserve voting stake, actual membership in the community to the Catholics only? It becomes increasingly difficult to do that. As more and more indentured servants are freed, they begin to constitute more and more of a plurality and ultimately a majority in Maryland. And so they create the Act of Religious Toleration. In the Carolinas, it's much more aristocratic. The chief executive maintains much greater control. Okay, they try to pass the fundamental constitution of the Carolinas, which virtually creates no legislative assembly at all. It's as though the proprietors can rule through imperial fiat, but there is a debate amongst the proprietors regarding the terms of this, and so it ultimately will be vetoed by them. In Pennsylvania, we have the frame of government. This is the Pennsylvania Constitution that I referred to a little bit earlier in a previous PowerPoint, either in the introduction or in 1.1a. It's called the frame of government. It carves out within the frame of government religious toleration, to be certain, but also a primary role for William Penn and his family. Okay, so it's not quite all the way to what you would call an authoritarian government, but it's about as close to an authoritarian government as you're going to get. There is a legislative assembly. They have very limited powers. William Penn has veto power over it. Okay? And it is as a reaction to this that the colony of Delaware will be formed. There will be a separation, a separatist movement within Pennsylvania, and they'll ultimately form Delaware. Between that and some difficulties that are taking place in Maryland. We now see a couple of simple slides here. We see figure 4.2, and this is again from the previous textbook that we used to use in this class, so don't go trying to find it. I looked through our textbook, and it didn't look to me like they have anything that's really the equivalent of this. But you look at the population growth from 1700, that's the light gray area, and 1760. And you look at the total population goes from 260,000 in 1700. By 1760, it's 1.5 million, closer to 1.6 million. So you see this mushrooming of the population. This is something, again, as I mentioned early on the foundings, we do not see this in the French colonies or the Dutch colonies or the Spanish colonies. Their populations remain fairly stable. They never rise that high. Okay, France and Canada will eventually begin to look at numbers like this, but the Spanish never will. Okay, and so it's this expansionism that is going to play out, and we're going to discuss it in the next PowerPoint in the discussion of in 1.2 in the discussion of international relations. This massive expansion of the population requires a land expansion. Well, the only way you're going to expand your land is at the expense of the natives, the native populations, which is why we'll have the Powhatan Wars and the Pequot Wars. Ultimately, the Beaver Wars will be related to this, etc. And you see that by far the largest population is going to be first in the Chesapeake, and then later, by the time of the U.S. Constitution, it will actually be in Virginia. The Chesapeake, remember, Virginia is included in the Chesapeake, and so Virginia is by far the most populous of the states. And of course, this does not include the slave populations. This does not include the slave populations. In a kind of interesting and ironic twist, if you'll recall from earlier in 11A, we discussed the various motivations, uh, pardon me, that brought the various European powers to the New World. For Spain, they came to the New World for one reason and one reason only: to extract from the New World as much gold and silver as they possibly could. Well, I explained briefly why this was. They were facing a period of deflation. They had too much goods and services, too little money, and so they needed to increase the specie amount. Well, the problem is, and kind of ironically, that they will be so successful at this by the end of the 16th century, they'll actually be importing close to $180 million worth of specie, that they actually tilt the scales the other way. Okay? In other words, when they come to the New World, they're facing a condition back in their domestic market, back at home, where they have too little money, and as a result, they have deflation. Well, such is going to be their success at importing gold and silver that they're going to end up with runaway inflation. Okay? When you have too much money and too little goods and services, the price goes up, is the simplest way to explain it. Okay? And so by the time of the end of the 16th century, the Spanish are facing massive inflation, with all of the negative consequences that come with massive inflation. And that's why one of the very famous things in history is the defeat of the Spanish Armada. It's actually a series of battles that take place between the Spanish fleet and the English fleet, all along the English Channel and into the North Sea and all the way up through Ireland. And that's usually attributed for the collapse of the Spanish Empire, but that's not entirely true. That was only one series of battles. They could easily have recovered from that. The problem was that the economic underpinning of the empire had been completely destroyed by runaway inflation, and that runaway inflation was caused by the success that they had in extracting gold and silver from the New World. Okay, and so it's just kind of an interesting side note. Now, we want to discuss at some length the mercantile trade system that is instituted by Great Britain in the middle of the 17th century. In 11A, we discussed the idea of trends, and one of the main trends I said to look at in this early period is Great Britain taking ever-increasing amounts of direct control over the colonies. Well, in terms of the development of mercantilism, you have direct control over the trading system, which prior to the 1650s they really don't have. And it should be noted that the Navigation Acts, which we're going to discuss in just a second here, really were never enforced until the 1690s with the development of the Admiralty Courts. Okay? Prior to that, the English kind of looked the other way. They didn't really enforce them that much. To explain the mercantile system is relatively simple. Okay? You have two basic categories of actors. You have the core and the periphery. As examples of the core, you have Britain, France, Holland, Spain. Okay, the European powers. These are manufacturers. They produce finished manufactured products. Okay? Then you have the periphery. The periphery are all the colonies. Okay, these are the North American colonies. These are the colonies in the West Indies. These are the colonies on the mainland. This is New France, New Holland. These are all the English colonies, okay? The way the trade pattern works is the periphery, okay, the colonies, produce raw materials, primary products from the agricultural and extraction industries, okay? They ship them to the core. The core then manufactures them into finished products. Now, this creates a balance of trade. All right? The primary products, agricultural products, for example, okay, tend to be very low value added. They tend to not use highly skilled labor. They're very land intensive. They're not very capital intensive. So they tend to be very low value added. They're cheap. Okay, the manufactured products are higher value added. They're higher value added because more labor and greater quantity and greater quality of labor is added to them. Okay, that's why they're higher value added. So they're more expensive. And so the periphery is shipping cheap goods to the core. The core is then manufacturing them into finished products and selling more expensive products back to the periphery. Okay, and so we look at the trade pattern here, and this is really at the height. This is by the turn of the 17th century. You have 56% of American exports going to England, 26% to the West Indies, to British colonies in the West Indies, to other peripheral actors. Okay, 18% to other core actors. This is because, for the most part, the English prohibited that. In terms of imports, 80% of them manufactured goods were coming from England, 18% from other areas in the West Indies. Those manufactured goods include, for example, rum, which was the primary one from the West Indies, 2% from other core actors, and 1% from Africa. Of course, the 1% from Africa being the slaves. This is in overall dollar amounts. Okay, and so what the mercantile system creates is a trading system in which the core actors, which are the manufacturers, have protected markets in their peripheral colonies. Okay, they have trade advantages in the colonies, and these colonies then become protected markets for the manufacturers in the core. So that British manufacturers have the colonies as a protected market. Okay, and just kind of as a note here, and we'll talk about this again as we get to the prelude to the Revolution. Between 1768 and 1772, the southern colonies have a positive balance of trade. They're actually making money hand over fist with the British, and this is because the primary products that they're selling, primarily tobacco and then later cotton, while they're cheaper in value individually, the quantity that they're producing is massive. And so it more than compensates for the manufactured goods that they're importing from England, so they end up with a positive trade balance. The middle colonies are about breaking even. They're a little bit negative, but they're basically breaking even, principally as a result of their shipbuilding industry. And the New England colonies are screwed. The New England colonies really don't produce raw materials, extraction and agriculture. They don't really produce that. And yet they're importing manufactured goods from England. And so they're running a negative trade balance, which is going to lead to a crisis that we'll deal with in just a second here with the Massachusetts Bills of Credit. And so they're screwed. This is why, among other things, that when we get to the prelude to the Revolution and the Revolution itself, all of the instigators of the American Revolution, all of them are from New England. Okay, that's why also New England is the epicenter of the revolution itself, at least in the early days. Here we see the trade pattern that I've just explained. Here you have your core actors. We focus on England here. England ships manufactured goods to its colonies in Africa, and manufactured goods, you see here, to its colonies in North America. Its colonies in North America ship basic agricultural and extraction products. You see, you can't read real well here, but fish, furs, whale products, etc. Naval stores, okay, that's largely from the middle colonies. Grain, iron, shipbuilding, tobacco, iron, rice, indigo, okay, all primary products. They then get manufactured and shipped back to the colonies. Of course, the primary product that Africa produces are the slaves, which ultimately all of them go to the West Indies first. And one of the things that I'll just mention tangentially here, the vast majority of slaves taken from Africa, over 80%, about 85%, never make it to North America. Most of them are sent to work in South America in the sugar fields and stay in the West Indies. Of that 85%, about 50% go to South America to work on the sugar plantations, and about 35% stay in the West Indies to work on the sugar plantations. Only about 15% actually come to North America. The mercantile system is becomes institutionalized in Great Britain with the passage of the Navigation Acts. And there will be a series of Navigation Acts passed from 1651 to the end of the century. Okay, and you see the basics of it here. Okay, all trade must be conducted in British-owned vessels. This cuts out the Dutch, it cuts out the French, it cuts out the Spanish. Okay, with 50% British crews. Now, the reason for this is the shipbuilding industry in the middle colonies, principally in Pennsylvania, but later in New Jersey as well, will begin to take over. They can produce ships cheaper because of the availability of lumber. Pennsylvania, after all, it's woodlands. Okay, so the availability of lumber makes shipbuilding much cheaper. And so those vessels are still going to be owned by Britain. But as time goes on, more and more of the crews are from the colonies, and the British want to prevent this. Okay, because it leads to an unemployment problem in Great Britain. And so instead, they institute the idea that 50% of the crew has to be from Great Britain. Okay, you have enumerated products. The idea of the enumerated products, and there's a long list of them. You could look up, you could Google it, and there's a long list of them. I try to truncate that a little bit here. England will be the exclusive destination for all of the primary products, all of the cash crops, all the tobacco, all the rice, will have to ship through England. Okay? Now, its final destination can be elsewhere, but that's not going to happen very much because you're going to lose your competitive advantage. Because when it gets to Great Britain, if it then ships somewhere else, you're going to increase the cost of it, okay, through tariffing. In addition, the Navigation Acts will subsidize British manufacturing and prohibit the development of a manufacturing industry in colonial North America and the West Indies. Okay, and so New England won't be allowed to develop a manufacturing industry. And then you see a tariff on foreign-produced staple products. This gives now, while this may seem very unfair and give an advantage to British manufacturers, it also gives an advantage to American producers of raw materials, to the tobacco farmers and later the cotton farmers. It gives them a protected market as well, okay? Because Great Britain will pass massive tariffs on raw materials, on staple products from everywhere else, from all of the colonies of France and the colonies of New Holland, and from Holland and France and Spain themselves. Okay, so it gives them an advantage too, and this will come back to haunt the colonies. It will lead to one of the economic crises we'll look at under the Articles of Confederation later on in PowerPoint 1.5, because once the revolution takes place, this trading system ends. And all of a sudden, the Americans don't have protected markets for their raw materials. And they'll be forced into competition, and they won't do well. And it will lead to a serious economic crisis. As a result of this colonial trade pattern, you have a massive increase in exports, which we saw with that one graphic that I showed you on tobacco. The distribution of the benefits from this system are going to be very uneven. This will be the real beginning of inequality economically, or be one of the precipitory causes of that inequality. The southern colonies and the Chesapeake colonies do quite well under the mercantile system. They actually have a positive balance of trade. The middle colonies basically break even principally as a result of their shipping industry. New England gets screwed because they have no cash crop, no staple, no raw materials, nothing really to ship to Great Britain. Okay, they have some stuff, but it's a tremendously lopsided relationship, and so New England will go progressively into debt as it moves towards the Revolutionary period. In addition, the port cities, okay, the cities on the coast, do much better. They make money hand over fist because they're the shippers. They're the ones shipping this stuff out. So the import-export business becomes exceptionally lucrative. Whereas in the back country, which is really where we are now in Western Pennsylvania, would be considered back country. We're in the sticks here, okay, in Western Pennsylvania, and will be long into the 19th century. We're in the sticks, okay. All of that back country, what's referred to geographically as the Piedmont region, where the Appalachian Mountains begin, they will suffer from very negative terms of trade, okay. And so it's a very uneven distribution of trade benefits. Now we see here in this slide a graphic depicting what I've just talked about in terms of colonial trade patterns. We see that, of course, the West Indies did the best. You see that and this is by between 1768 and 1772. We see that the West Indies are producing a grand total of about almost 4 million pounds a year. This is followed by the Chesapeake colonies, then the Lower South, the Middle colonies, who are just about even. This is largely because of the shipbuilding industry. And then we see that the New England colonies are the worst off. And this will result in a negative balance of trade for them. We have two credit crises, one of which I've kind of already alluded to, the Maryland tobacco crisis. Okay, as a result of using tobacco as the backbone, this creates a problem as tobacco production increases and the price of tobacco goes down. Creditors end up being paid back less than they've lent out. Okay, so they're going to pass the Maryland Tobacco Act, which is going to more standardize the price of tobacco and the quality of tobacco. In terms of the Massachusetts bills of credit, the easiest way to explain it, okay, money, even in modern terms, money effectively is an IOU. In point of fact, the money that you have in your pocket right now, the currency, is an IOU from the Federal Reserve of the United States. This, of course, is long before the Federal Reserve existed. But it's effectively an IOU. Okay? The Massachusetts importers would purchase goods from England, and they would give them an IOU, a bill of credit, in compensation. That bill of credit could then be exchanged for hard currency, which at this point was specie. Understood? So you have gold and silver. Now the problem is, if you overissue this, there gets to be a problem. Okay? And so, for example, let us suppose that we have 1 ounce of gold. That's how much specie we have. We purchase a commodity from Great Britain. We give them a bill of credit worth 1 ounce of gold in exchange for this. We then purchase more from England and give that exporter a bill of credit for 1 ounce of gold. We are playing the probability that at any point in time, both of these people that we've issued these bills to won't come in and demand their gold. This ultimately, the Federal Reserve System is still based on this idea, this probabilistic model. It's why there's such a thing as a reserve requirement. We won't get into it in any great length, but in the 1930s, there are a series of runs on American banks. Okay? And the problem with it is that they have an insufficient amount of money deposited. Okay? Well, in this case, in the case of Massachusetts bills of credit, they don't have enough gold to cover all of the bills of credit they've given out. But that's not really that much of a problem, because there is a probability. What is the probability that at any point in time, all of your creditors will come in demanding payment? Okay? Not a problem. Well, in Massachusetts, it becomes a problem for reasons that we've just talked about. They are running a dramatic imbalance in trade, okay? And so they have to continually issue more and more of these bills of credit with less and less to back it up, okay? And so the creditors, as they come in to exchange their bills of credit, to exchange their IOUs, are progressively getting less and less. In the example that I just went over, okay, if we have 1 ounce of gold and we give each of 2 creditors an IOU for that ounce of gold. If they come at the same time to exchange their IOUs, the best we can do is give them each 1/2 an ounce of gold, because that's all we have. And so they both lose 50% the value of the IOU. This is happening more and more as the 17th century draws into the 18th century. Okay, and so they'll issue a regulation limiting the issuance of these bills of credit. And while I'm at the 50-minute mark, I've really only got a couple of slides left here. So we're just going to finish this off. We're going to go over, it'll still be under an hour. We're going to go over just a little bit. In terms of the labor systems, I've talked at some length about the indentured servants. This is a perfectly reasonable labor system, really up until to the late part of the 17th century, till the 1680s and 1690s. But by that point, production has increased so much, and demand in England has increased so much, that there is an insufficient number of people willing to sell their services into indentured servitude in exchange for passage to the New World. And so there simply isn't enough labor by relying on the indentured servants. And so really in the last quarter of the 17th century, the slave trade is going to take off. Okay, and this is when the plantation system will start to develop in the South. It's this shortage of indentured servants that ultimately leads to the importation of African slaves. Originally, prior to this period, there aren't that many slaves being imported to the West Indies, and then ultimately to North America and to the South America. And so the British give the Royal African Company monopolistic control over the slave trade from Africa, okay, which means they can regulate prices, etc. Well, by the end of the 17th century, by 1700, the expansion of production in the United States, particularly actually in the lower South and in the Chesapeake region, makes it impossible for any one producer, for any one import-exporter, okay, to produce enough slaves to soak up the demand for labor. And so the Royal African Company is going to lose its monopolistic control over the slave trade, and you're going to have whole hosts of people now engaging in what becomes an ever increasingly lucrative slave trade from Africa. And there's a couple of things just kind of at the end here as we finish up this discussion on the labor systems that we should note. In the early days, okay, of the importation of African slaves, which is really from 1650 to really through the 1680s, it's a minority of slaves that are actually taken by force. There's two things that will bring them there. One is the natives in Africa, the tribes in Africa, constantly were at war with each other. And what would happen is you would end up with captives of rival tribes. You would then take those captives and sell them into slavery. Okay, you would ransom them into slavery. Some of the slaves, a small minority of them, sold themselves into slavery. Okay, because their prospects in Africa weren't very good. It was only in the 1690s and thereafter that they started really being taken by force, that the English and that the Royal African Company and other shippers, slave traders, would go in and take them by force. And finally here at the end, and I went over, as I said, by about 4 minutes, this is an overview of everything we've talked about with the English colonies. You see the date of the founding of the colony, the earliest being Virginia. You see the established religion, and really only Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay and some of the others are really the only ones that were very adamant about that. That had as their rules that you had to be a member of the religious community. In Jamestown, you didn't. Ultimately, in Virginia, you have to be a landowner. But you see, as I mentioned, also the difference between the Puritan and the Anglican Church. The Anglicans were simply reforming the Church of England. The Puritans had completely separated from it. This is the type of economy, all of which we've talked about, and the government. And that concludes. I apologize for being a little bit over here. I'm going to try to prevent that from happening as much as possible. I try to put in my mind that I'm cutting into somebody else's class time, although really I'm not, because if this were a class that began at quarter to the hour, you have 50 minutes and then another 10 minutes before someone else starts. So I have still another 5 minutes and 20 seconds or something like that, but we're done here. That concludes PowerPoint 1.1, this being 1.1b. That concludes it. And next week we'll start to deal with the early international relations.